Tonight we slip quietly into the latrine shadows of the Middle Ages, because nothing says bedtime story quite like medieval toilet habits.
The night is still, and you find yourself walking down a narrow cobblestone street. The air is damp, the kind of damp that clings to your sleeves and makes you wonder if you should have brought an extra cloak. You don't see much light, just the flicker of a torch outside the Guildhall and the moon pushing through a low curtain of clouds. The town is asleep, or at least trying to be, because the noise of dripping gutters and the faint splash of water, or something not quite water, reminds you that medieval sanitation was, let's say, less flush and forget and more hope for the best. Before we dive too far, here's a cheeky warning. You probably won't make it through this day, or this night, rather. Not because of danger, but because if you manage to listen to me talk about medieval toilets without drifting off, you deserve a prize. Maybe a bar of soap. Or a medieval one which was basically lye, animal fat, and a side of skin irritation. Now, since you're here, I'd love for you to tap that like button gently, as though you were closing a creaky wooden privy door, and maybe subscribe. These tales get stranger the deeper we go, and honestly, your company keeps the candle burning. And while you're still awake, comment your location and local time below. I'm curious where in the world you are listening, and if you're nodding off at 11 p.m. or at 3 in the afternoon pretending to work. You take a step further into the medieval town, and immediately you're reminded of something crucial. The Middle Ages smelled colorful. Waste disposal wasn't centralized. Instead, chamber pots were common. You'd keep one under your bed, use it at night, and then in the morning, if you were polite, you'd empty it into a cesspit or a public latrine. If you weren't polite, you'd just toss it out the window. People really did yell "Gardaloo" before tossing waste from above. If you're wondering whether everyone respected the warning. No. Sometimes it was more of a surprise shower. Major historical fact. By the 14th century, many larger towns actually had public latrines, often built over rivers so that flowing water could carry waste away. Imagine a wooden outhouse directly above your local stream. Romantic, right? Weird tidbit. Monks in some monasteries actually shared long communal latrine benches, sometimes with 20 or 30 seats side by side. No dividers. Quiet reflection was apparently optional. If you think your office bathroom lacks privacy, try chanting psalms while Brother Edmund sits 2 inches away. Historians still debate whether medieval cesspits were emptied regularly or only when absolutely overflowing. Records suggest both. Either way, you definitely remember the day when the pit cleaners came to town. You pause by a wooden house, look up, and there's a narrow gutter. A suspicious splash hits the stones nearby. You decide not to look up. Wise choice. The night deepens, the noises quiet down, and you feel your shoulders unclench. The warmth of the imagery, the odd humor of history, and the steady rhythm of your steps begin to blur into something drowsy. Now let's ease into tonight's journey, deeper into the story of where medieval folk sat, squatted, and sometimes didn't bother at all.
You walk toward the castle on the hill, its silhouette sharp against the dim sky, a place of power, of nobility, and, yes, of toilets. You climb a steep path, your footsteps muffled by moss and damp earth. As you pass through the gate, the air grows colder, but inside the walls, you notice a curious feature jutting from the upper floors. Little stone boxes projecting out over the courtyard. These are garderobes, castle toilets. They emptied directly down the walls, creating what you might generously call a moat of memories. You run your hand along the rough wall, feeling the chill stone. Imagine being a servant whose job was to clean beneath the garderobes. Royalty might have worn velvet and gold, but their waste was just as ordinary, except perhaps when colored by the lavish medieval diet, which tended to involve far too much meat and wine. Major historical fact: garderobes often doubled as storage closets for clothes. The belief was that the ammonia fumes from waste would kill off fleas and moths. Yes, your lord's best tunic could hang right above the chute. Efficient in a horrifying sort of way. Weird tidbit. Some noble households had what was called a gong farmer or gong scourer, a professional cesspit cleaner. They worked at night when the smell would bother fewer people, and they were paid relatively well for such dangerous, thankless work. Falling into a cesspit was a genuine occupational hazard. A career pitfall, if you will. Historians still debate how common private garderobes were outside castles and monasteries. Ordinary townsfolk rarely had them. The stonework was too expensive. Most relied on shared pits or buckets. You stand in the castle courtyard, and you hear the faint trickle of water somewhere far below. The torches along the wall flicker, casting shadows across arched windows. You picture a noble sitting in their garderobe high above, gazing out through a little slit in the wall as though it were a scenic balcony, except the view was probably less inspiring. It's funny, in a quiet way, how something so basic tied everyone together. Kings, peasants, monks, children, they all had to figure out where to go. And often the answer was, wherever you could. You remember the narrow street you passed earlier with its dripping gutter, and you realize that medieval life was really a patchwork of habits, from the humble chamber pot to the lofty garderobe. The thought lingers as you lean against the wall, letting the cool stone steady you. Your breath slows. The absurdity of it all, the rituals, the smells, the ingenuity and the lack thereof, feels oddly comforting. You smile faintly, the way you might smile at a bedtime story that's equal parts ridiculous and true. And as the night deepens around you, the castle seems less like a fortress and more like a dreamscape, one filled with flickering torches and the strange, steady rhythm of medieval life winding down into silence. The castle fades behind you as you step down into the town again, your boots crunching against gravel. The streets are narrow, the houses leaning forward as if gossiping with one another over the alley below. In a way, they were gossiping through their windows and gutters, where chamber pots were emptied. You keep close to the middle, away from the walls, because you've already learned your lesson about suspicious drips from above. The town has quieted, but not entirely. You hear a soft thud of a wooden lid, the shuffle of someone setting down a bucket. Somewhere a baby cries, and someone murmurs comfort. And then, yes, unmistakably, a splash into a gutter. That's medieval midnight for you. Major historical fact: by the 12th century, some cities like London actually had ordinances requiring householders to build cesspits at least 2.5 feet away from their neighbors' walls, because leaking pits were causing structural damage. Imagine your house leaning dangerously because your neighbor's waste pit overflowed. Not exactly the kind of property dispute you want. Weird tidbit: in parts of medieval France, public latrines were sometimes built into bridges. So while you crossed the Seine, you could stop for other business. A literal pit stop over the water. Medieval multitasking at its finest. Historians still debate how strictly these waste regulations were enforced. Some argue they were mostly ignored unless a wealthy neighbor complained, which seems very on-brand for human history. You pause near a tavern. The air smells of ale, wood smoke, and something less poetic wafting from the back alley. Inns often had their own cesspits, but they filled quickly, and travelers weren't exactly careful. If you think modern gas station bathrooms are bad, picture a wooden bench with holes above a pit that hadn't been emptied in a season. And yet, there's a strange coziness in the hum of voices inside the tavern, the glow of firelight through cracks in the shutters. Life went on, even with all its smells and messes. You lean against a wall and let your eyes half close. The absurdity lulls you. Somehow, the less glamorous details of medieval life make the world feel more human, more ordinary, and therefore more soothing. The path takes you toward the monastery at the edge of town. Its tall stone walls rise up in the moonlight, silent but watchful. You step through a small wooden gate, and suddenly the sounds of town fade away. It's quieter here, solemn. The only sound is the crunch of gravel under your feet and the occasional flutter of an owl's wings. The monks lived by rhythms of prayer, study, and yes, visits to the latrine. You find the building easily, because it's attached to the dormitory. A long stone structure jutting out, with a channel of water running underneath. The monastic latrines were surprisingly advanced. A stream was often diverted to carry waste away, an early plumbing system that feels shockingly modern, until you imagine 30 men sitting in a row, humming psalms with no walls between them. Major historical fact. The great monastery at Cluny, in France, had enormous latrine blocks with water channels beneath them, connected to nearby streams. These facilities were considered marvels of monastic engineering. Weird tidbit. Some monasteries had rules about how many times you could visit the latrine in a day. In one Benedictine house, monks were permitted to go up to 7 times. Beyond that, you might need to get special permission, which is either hilarious or horrifying depending on your perspective. Historians still debate whether monks truly used these spaces in silence or if they allowed themselves whispered conversation. Given the human tendency to chat, I'd wager the latter. You sit on a stone step, looking at the long building. In the moonlight, it feels almost majestic, a monument not just to prayer and scholarship, but to the practicalities of the human body. There's something oddly grounding about it. A reminder that even those who spent their lives contemplating eternity had to find time for very earthly needs. You lean back against the wall, your breath slowing. The stone is cool at your back, the air quiet, and you imagine the monks asleep above, their rhythm steady and calm. For a moment, you almost wish you could join them. Not in the latrine, of course, but in the peace of a world where even the strangest details had their order and place. You wake, or maybe you never really slept, as dawn stretches pale fingers of light over the rooftops. The town begins to stir, and with it the smell. Morning is when chamber pots get emptied. You walk carefully through the street, stepping over puddles that you hope are just water. A woman appears at a window above, yawning as she tips her pot into the gutter with practiced ease. It splashes onto the stones below and slowly seeps toward the drain. You step aside politely, as though she had merely opened her window to toss out flower petals. Welcome to the medieval version of Trash Day. Major historical fact. In many medieval cities, the cry of "Garde à l'eau," derived from the French gardes l'eau, meaning "watch out for the water," was shouted before tossing waste from the window. In Edinburgh, it became so common that the phrase entered local slang. Weird tidbit. Some households preferred to keep their chamber pots indoors until morning, believing that spirits of the night might sneak in if the waste was thrown out too soon. Nothing says supernatural horror like a ghost annoyed at poor sanitation. Historians still debate whether people consistently shouted their warning or if most simply assumed that anyone walking below should have known better than to hug the walls. Personally, I'd keep a sturdy hat nearby. You watch as the liquid trickles toward a larger gutter, joining contributions from other homes. The street begins to smell stronger, but people pass by without complaint, chatting about bread, markets, or the weather. Human adaptability is impressive. It turns out you can get used to almost anything, especially when everyone around you is equally smelly. There's a strange rhythm to it, though, a shared acceptance of discomfort, an everyday ritual of disposal. It makes you wonder what habits of your own age will seem equally absurd to people centuries from now. Perhaps they'll laugh at bottled water or the way we queue for coffee. Or maybe they'll just shake their heads and say, "At least they didn't toss things out of the window." The sun climbs higher, and you wander toward the marketplace. Here, the world feels louder, more colorful. Stalls of spices, fabrics, bread, and fish. Chickens scatter underfoot, Dogs bark, children chase one another between carts. And, of course, there's the unmistakable odor of waste, drifting from the edge of the market square where a public latrine stands. It's a simple wooden structure with a pit beneath, covered by planks. A faint buzz of flies greets you before you even step closer. You watch as a merchant ducks inside, his face calm, his pace unhurried. Privacy wasn't exactly a concern. Major historical fact: public latrines existed in many medieval towns, especially in places with large markets. Some were free while others charged a small fee, often paid to a caretaker responsible for cleaning. The caretakers were not envied. Weird tidbit: archaeologists have found parasite eggs in the remains of medieval cesspits, proof that intestinal worms were a common companion of daily life. So yes, not only did people share benches, they likely shared more than they realized. Historians still debate how often cesspits were emptied. Some records suggest once a year, others far less. Imagine being the unlucky soul assigned that task after a particularly festive winter. As you stand nearby, a boy selling apples waves his hand across his face and mutters about the smell. Then he shrugs and bites into an apple anyway. Life doesn't pause for unpleasant odors. Shoppers haggle, traders boast, children laugh, and the world keeps turning. You notice that the latrine itself is decorated with carved patterns along the wooden planks. Even in filth, there's room for a touch of artistry. Perhaps it was someone's way of saying, if we must sit together, let it at least look decent. The thought lingers as you move back into the bustle of the marketplace, blending into the crowd. The smells, the colors, the voices all mix together until it feels almost dreamlike, as though you're drifting through a half-remembered story. By midday, the warmth of the sun makes everything more pungent. The streets hum with the chatter of merchants, but beneath it lies another hum, the gentle chorus of flies. You pause at the edge of an alley where laundry flaps between buildings, and there it is again. The sudden splash of liquid poured from above. You step back just in time. Congratulations, you survived another round. Major historical fact: many medieval cities created regulations forbidding people from dumping chamber pots directly onto the street. Instead, they were supposed to take waste to designated cesspools or rivers. Of course, rules on parchment are one thing, but practice is another entirely. Weird tidbit: in some towns, homeowners carved little chutes, called gargoyles, from the upper floor to direct waste onto the street below. They were meant for rainwater, but waste found its way down as well. A medieval multitasking system, if you will. Historians still debate how strictly such regulations were enforced. Was there really a constable lurking about to fine people for improper tossing? Or was it more like modern jaywalking, technically illegal, rarely punished? You walk on, past bakeries where the smell of warm bread fights valiantly against less appetizing odors. For a moment, the scent of yeast and smoke almost wins. Almost. The wind shifts and the balance tips again. As you stroll, you imagine what the world must have felt like then. No deodorant, no toothpaste, no perfume shops. Instead, the collective smells of humans, animals, and their endless offerings to the street. Yet life carried on, songs sung, love declared, children born, markets thriving. Perhaps that's the real marvel. Resilience wrapped in stench. You find yourself near a river that cuts through the town. Its surface glimmers in the sun, reflecting the sky like polished steel. From a distance, it looks picturesque, a painting come to life. Up close, it tells a different story. Women kneel at the edge to wash clothes, their chatter bright and lively, while just a few yards upstream, a tanner rinses hides, releasing clouds of oily residue into the current. Major historical fact: Rivers were the lifeblood of medieval cities, serving as drinking water, laundry sites, transport routes, and unfortunately, open sewers. Many towns lacked formal drainage systems, relying on rivers to carry away waste. Weird tidbit. Some people believed that fast-moving water had purifying powers. Tossing waste into a river was thought to be a cleaner, even almost spiritual act, as though the current itself were a holy laundromat for sins and smells. Historians still debate how aware medieval people were of waterborne illness. Some argue they suspected contamination but lacked vocabulary to describe it. Others say they considered bad smells, miasma, the true culprit. Either way, the river was both salvation and threat. You sit on the bank watching children skip stones. Their laughter rings out over the rippling water, blending with the clatter of hooves on the bridge above. You notice a dog waiting near the women washing clothes, tail wagging, entirely unbothered by what swirls around its legs. Dogs, it seems, have always had low standards. The current carries everything downstream. Soap suds, scraps of leather, and less identifiable substances. Still, the river feels alive, vibrant with movement, and strangely soothing if you keep your eyes half closed and your nose tilted away from the wind. For a moment, you almost forget the smell. Almost. The day lingers on, and you find yourself wandering toward the monastery that looms on the hill. Its stone walls rise solid and serene, promising peace, prayer, and perhaps, though you hesitate to hope, cleanliness. You step inside the cloister, where monks shuffle quietly in brown robes, their sandals whispering against the flagstones. Major historical fact: monasteries often had some of the best toilet facilities of the Middle Ages. Many were built with long latrine blocks over running streams, allowing waste to be carried away by water. It was practical, if not exactly luxurious. Weird tidbit. Some monks believed that going to the latrine together was a spiritual act of humility. Picture it. A row of silent men, all doing their business in harmony, like a choir without music. Historians still debate whether these latrine blocks were truly effective at keeping monasteries cleaner than towns. The engineering was clever, but constant use and limited maintenance may have undone some of the benefit. You walk through the cloister garden, where herbs grow in neat rows. The sharp scent of mint and rosemary mingles with the faint sound of water trickling somewhere beneath the stone floor. Perhaps it's the stream that carries everything away. A monk glides past, nodding politely, his face serene, as though he hasn't just emerged from one of the more communal experiences of the day. You sit on a cool bench, looking up at the arches and carved capitals, marveling at how a place of prayer could be so practical too. Even the medieval soul needed plumbing. And, you suspect, even monks had days when the silent prayer wasn't so silent. Later in the evening, the town square comes alive. Merchants pack up their stalls, musicians strike up simple tunes, and neighbors gather to swap gossip. You find yourself at the edge of a small crowd, listening as a storyteller spins a tale about knights, dragons, and impossible quests. But then another interruption. From the edge of the square comes the unmistakable aroma of something less heroic. You glance toward the source, the public latrine, tucked behind a timber frame, a rickety structure, half wood, half wishful thinking. Major historical fact: public latrines were rare but not unheard of in medieval Europe. Some towns built them as a civic service, though maintenance was often poor, and their reputation quickly soured. Weird tidbit. In a few towns, using the public latrine cost a small fee. Imagine paying a penny for the privilege of enduring someone else's leftovers before you. Not exactly luxury service. Historians still debate how common these facilities were. Were they a widespread civic gesture, or just scattered experiments. Evidence is patchy, as the latrines themselves rarely survived long enough to become ruins worth preserving. You edge closer out of curiosity, peeking at the wooden doors and the line of weary faces outside. People shuffle, waiting their turn, holding baskets or chatting as if nothing were unusual. It's a reminder. In every age, waiting for a bathroom has been part of the human story. The music in the square swells again, drowning out the less poetic noises from behind the boards. A juggler tosses apples into the air, children clap, and for a moment you wonder if the Middle Ages were just a long balancing act between wonder and waste. The night air grows cool, and torches flicker along the streets. You wander toward the castle, its towers outlined against the fading sky. Inside, you expect grandeur, maybe even a whiff of lavender. Instead, you find, well, more of the same, only higher up. Major historical fact: castles often had garderobes, small stone rooms built into the walls. Waste dropped through a chute, sometimes straight into the moat below. Yes, the same moat that attackers might later swim or wade through. Talk about adding insult to injury. Weird tidbit: people sometimes stored clothing in garderobes, believing the strong odor of waste repelled moths. So, in a strange twist, the dirtiest corner became the medieval version of a mothball closet. Historians still debate just how effective these garderobes were. Did the smell linger in the castle halls, or did the stone walls and drafts whisk it away? Opinions differ, but one thing is certain: luxury did not always mean comfort. You peer out a narrow slit window, watching moonlight ripple over the moat. Imagine a knight in armor, trudging through that water to lay siege. Brave? Absolutely. Smelly? Without question. Inside, a tapestry flutters in the breeze, and you swear it carries a faint echo of everything that has passed through the chute below. Royal life, it seems, was not spared the realities of being human. And so you walk away, silently thanking the 21st century for plumbing and mothballs. Back in town, the tavern glows with warm light. Laughter spills into the street, the sound of mugs clinking and songs rising into the night. You step inside, greeted by the thick scent of ale, with smoke and something fried. At last, a pleasant smell, at least until the door at the back creaks open. Major historical fact: taverns, like many public places, often had no dedicated toilets. Patrons simply slipped outside, into alleys, or used buckets provided in corners. Drinking and proximity made for interesting combinations. Weird tidbit: some taverns kept sand-covered troughs indoors, discreetly placed, so men wouldn't have to leave their mugs unattended. Think of it as the medieval precursor to the urinal, though less glamorous, if that's possible. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Did every bustling alehouse reek of such ingenuity, or were these exceptions in larger cities? The records don't always agree. You sit by the fire, mug in hand, watching a bard strum a lute. His voice carries over the din, soft and lilting, as though he's unaware of the faint draft coming from that questionable back door. Patrons cheer, someone spills ale, and a dog noses around under the tables, blissfully unaware of hygiene debates. The tavern feels alive, buzzing with joy and humanity, reminding you that comfort has always been relative. After enough ale, maybe even the draft from the back door fades away. The dawn creeps in with a pale glow. You wake to the sound of roosters crowing and the shuffle of feet in the courtyard below. People are already busy, hauling water, sweeping floors, feeding animals. You stretch, but before you even step outside, you notice something curious tucked by the bed. Major historical fact: chamber pots were a standard feature in medieval households. Everyone from peasants to kings used them, especially at night, when going outside was inconvenient or unsafe. Weird tidbit. Wealthy households sometimes commissioned decorated chamber pots, painted with witty sayings or even crude jokes. Imagine waking up, groggy, and being greeted by medieval graffiti that reminded you not to miss. Historians still debate how common such decorated pots were. Were they a cheeky trend among elites, or scattered oddities that amused a few families? The surviving examples leave us guessing. You lift the pot, gingerly of course, and notice its surprisingly solid weight, clay cool against your hands. You set it back down, relieved it's empty, and step out into the street. Outside, neighbors chat as they toss water onto cobblestones, as though the night left behind more than dreams. The morning air feels fresh, almost new, almost, until someone empties another pot out a window, and just like that, the day begins again. By mid-morning, you wander into a workshop. The air is thick with the smell of leather, glue, and wood shavings. A craftsman hammers steadily at a bench, pausing only to sip from a cup. Behind him, a bucket sits discreetly in the corner. Major historical fact: many workshops kept buckets or pits indoors so workers wouldn't have to leave their tasks for nature's interruptions. Kept production steady, though it didn't make the air more pleasant. Weird tidbit. In some guilds, apprentices were tasked with emptying those buckets at the end of the day. It was part of their training. Less glamorous than learning to hammer iron or stitch shoes, but equally unforgettable. Historians still debate whether such practices were widespread or limited to certain trades. The written records tend to focus more on contracts and wages than where people relieve themselves, which feels unfair to the apprentices. You sit on a stool, watching sawdust gather on the floor. The craftsman hums a tune, his hands skilled and steady. The rhythm of his work almost lulls you into forgetting the bucket at his feet. Almost. Outside, children play, their laughter drifting through the open shutters. The contrast is sharp. The innocence of a game of tag, the reality of waste management indoors. Life carried on in layers, some more fragrant than others. The road outside the workshop leads you into the market square. Stalls brim with vegetables, fish, bolts of cloth, and chatter. You weave through the crowd, ears filled with bargaining voices. Then you notice something practical, almost hidden, near the edge of the square. A trench running alongside the stalls, covered partly by wooden planks. Major historical fact: many medieval towns dug open ditches through streets and marketplaces to carry away rainwater and waste. These trenches were early drainage systems, though they doubled as garbage chutes for anything people wanted to discard. Weird tidbit. In some towns, pigs were deliberately released into the streets to root through the refuse, a kind of living sanitation service. Of course, the pigs left their own deposits, so cleanliness was relative. Historians still debate how effective these trenches were. Some say they kept streets marginally cleaner. Others suggest they simply concentrated the mess into convenient streams. You crouch by the trench, watching murky water trickle along, carrying scraps of cabbage and something you decide not to identify. Children skip over the planks with ease, as though it's all just another part of daily life. A merchant swats at a pig that noses too close to his apple cart. And yet, amid the noise and smells, the market feels vibrant, alive with energy. Somehow, humanity thrives even when the streets themselves seem to sigh under the weight of it all. By afternoon, you wander toward the town walls. Beyond them, the countryside stretches wide and green, dotted with sheep. Here, life feels calmer. Farmers tend their fields, shepherds lean on staffs, and the air carries only the faintest memory of town odors. Major historical fact: rural households often relied on simple pit latrines dug near the home. These were less sophisticated than city garderobes but often more private, tucked into gardens or behind barns. Weird tidbit: in some villages, people lined their pits with straw or moss to reduce smell. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing, and at least it made for easier composting. Historians still debate whether rural households maintained cleaner surroundings than townsfolk. Fewer people meant less mess, but farms also brought livestock into close proximity, which had its own challenges. You sit beneath a tree, watching sheep shuffle in the grass. Their bells jingle softly, a rhythm that feels oddly soothing. A farmer passes by, nodding politely, his hands rough from work but his demeanor gentle. The simplicity of rural life seems almost peaceful, until you spot the pit behind the barn and remember why you're here. Still, the air is fresher, the pace slower, the sense of space a relief after crowded streets. Here, at least, you can breathe. You find yourself in the company of a physician, or at least someone who claims the title. His robe is heavy, his beard long, and his pouch brims with herbs that smell both earthy and sharp. He beckons you to sit while he explains the mysteries of the human body with an air of great authority. Major historical fact: medieval medicine leaned heavily on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A balance among them meant health. Imbalance brought illness. Naturally, waste played a central role in diagnosis. Weird tidbit: physicians sometimes inspected a patient's urine in a glass flask, holding it up to the light to analyze color, smell, and even taste. Yes, taste. Medieval job hazards, apparently. Historians still debate how accurate these urine examinations were. Did they sometimes stumble onto real insights, or were they more ritual than science? Modern medicine owes them a nod, but not too much. The physician swirls a sample in his flask, eyes narrowing. He mutters something about heat and dampness, then adds a pinch of herbs to your hand with instructions you don't quite understand. You nod politely, deciding you won't follow through. Outside, the air feels cleaner, the sky wider, but you carry with you the image of a man squinting at urine like it's fine wine, and somehow that image sticks. Your steps take you next to the home of a midwife, a woman brisk and sharp-eyed, busy with the endless cycle of births in the town. She welcomes you with the warmth of someone used to company, then continues mixing herbs in a bowl by the fire. Major historical fact: midwives were essential figures in medieval communities, providing not just birthing care but also advice on hygiene, remedies, and the practical management of daily bodily needs. Weird tidbit: some midwives advised women to keep buckets of moss or cloths nearby during labor, not just for the obvious reasons, but because the waste was thought to carry omens about the child's future health. Historians still debate how much of this advice was rooted in medical tradition versus folk belief. Written records often underplay midwives' knowledge, leaving us with fragments of their wisdom. You sit by the fire, listening to her hum while she stirs. The room smells of sage and lavender, a sharp contrast to the streets outside. The fire crackles, and for a moment, you feel cocooned in a small oasis of care. She smiles at you knowingly, as though she understands more than you've asked. Then she turns back to her herbs, leaving you with the sense that in a world of questionable sanitation, midwives were quiet anchors of stability. The church bells toll in the distance, pulling you toward their sound. You wander into a stone church, cool and dim, where candles flicker against high arches. The air smells faintly of incense and old wood, masking the more earthly realities that linger just outside its doors. Major historical fact: Medieval religious texts sometimes used bodily functions as metaphors for spiritual lessons. Waste could symbolize sin, and cleansing could represent repentance. Even toilets, in their humble way, became tools for teaching morality. Weird tidbit. Some monks believed that demons lurked near latrines, waiting to catch the unwary. It gave holding it in a whole new theological justification. Historians still debate whether these warnings were serious fears or cautionary tales meant to encourage mindfulness. Were they spiritual truths, or simply attempts at crowd control in communal spaces? You kneel on a wooden pew, listening to the echoes of a chant rising toward the rafters. The sound feels timeless, almost otherworldly. But as the incense wafts by, you can't help remembering the garderobe shoot you saw in the monastery earlier. Even holiness, it seems, couldn't escape plumbing. You rise again, slipping out into the daylight, the bells still resonating in your chest. Religion, like waste, was simply everywhere. Later in the day, you find yourself at a roadside shrine, a small stone cross set where travelers pause for prayer. A group gathers, murmuring blessings before continuing their journey. And as you linger, you overhear something curious. A whispered discussion about proper times for relieving oneself. Major historical fact: medieval texts occasionally advised moderation in eating and drinking to avoid frequent trips to the latrine, framing bodily control as a sign of moral discipline. Weird tidbit. Some devotional manuals even recommended offering up one's discomfort when holding it in as a small act of piety. Yes, your bladder could become a spiritual offering. Historians still debate how widely these ideas were followed in daily life. Was it common practice or lofty advice that few bothered to heed? After all, human nature is stubborn. You walk on, the road stretching into the countryside. Pilgrims shuffle by, staffs in hand, singing softly as they head toward some distant holy site. Their journey is long, their pace slow, and you realize the medieval experience of travel was shaped as much by the availability of roadside bushes as by devotion. The sun dips low, casting warm light across the fields. And you wonder if perhaps one of the most unspoken bonds across all of history is simply, where do we go, and how do we endure until we find it? By evening, the tavern is lively again, voices rising above the music of a fiddle. But this time you notice the jokes. A group of men huddle near the fire, swapping stories, and more than one punchline seems to involve the latrine. You laugh despite yourself. It turns out toilet humor is not just modern. Major historical fact: medieval literature often contained body jokes and toilet humor. From Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to lesser-known fabliaux, bodily functions were frequent subjects of comedy. Weird tidbit. In some manuscripts, monks doodled in the margins, tiny drawings of people bending over garderobes or animals doing decidedly undignified things. Even in sacred texts, the human impulse for silliness found its way. Historians still debate whether these jokes were universal crowd pleasers or confined to certain circles. Did peasants laugh as much as nobles at such humor, or were there different audiences for different kinds of jokes? You sit at the edge of the group, ale in hand, chuckling as a man acts out the gestures of someone slipping into a cesspit. The crowd roars with laughter, slapping tables, spilling drink. For a moment, the medieval world feels very close, not strange but familiar. Humans across centuries have always laughed at the same things. The fire crackles, mugs clink, and you realize laughter might have been the best deodorizer of all. The next morning, you pass by a troupe of traveling performers setting up a stage in the square. Their costumes are bright, their props simple, but their energy draws a crowd. Soon, they launch into a play filled with exaggerated gestures, pratfalls, and, you guessed it, latrine jokes. Major historical fact. Medieval plays, especially farces performed in marketplaces, often included crude humor. Toilets, flatulence, and waste were common themes, easy to understand and quick to get a laugh. Weird tidbit. In some performances, a fool character carried a mock chamber pot as a prop, using it to punctuate jokes or chase other actors across the stage. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of slapstick. Historians still debate whether these performances were officially tolerated by authorities or frowned upon as indecent. Yet they were undeniably popular, drawing crowds wherever they appeared. You stand among the townsfolk, laughter bubbling around you as the fool prances with his prop. Children squeal, merchants grin. Even stern-faced elders can't resist a smirk. The performance is crude, yes, but it binds the community in shared laughter. As the play ends, the actors bow, chamber pot held aloft like a crown. The audience cheers, coins are tossed, and life goes on, stitched together by humor as much as hardship. You leave the square smiling, realizing that even in the grimiest corners of history, laughter had a way of making things bearable. You wander back toward the town hall, its tall wooden beams casting sharp shadows in the morning light. Here, serious matters are handled: justice, disputes, punishments. But even in this austere space, toilets creep into the conversation. Major historical fact. Some medieval towns had laws that fined residents for emptying chamber pots out of windows at the wrong time. The practice was common, but rules varied. Sometimes you could do it only after calling out a warning. Weird tidbit. One town ordinance in France actually required the words, "Guard low," literally, "Watch out for the water," to be shouted before dumping. Of course, not everyone was polite enough to follow through. Historians still debate how strictly these laws were enforced. Were they really patrolling for chamberpot offenders? Or was it more of a deterrent that only occasionally resulted in fines? You imagine the scene. A poor soul strolling beneath a window, a splash from above, and suddenly, evidence for the town court. The fine might have stung, but probably not as much as the surprise. The judge drones on, clerks scratch with quills, and yet you can't help but grin. In a world full of knights, cathedrals, and kings, sometimes the biggest legal problem was falling waste. That afternoon, you wander toward the town prison. The place is dank, shadows stretching across the stone walls. Yet even here, the toilet makes its presence known. Major historical fact. Medieval prisons often had rudimentary latrines, sometimes just holes leading to cesspits. Prisoners shared the spaces, and the smell was reportedly unbearable. Weird tidbit. In some cases, prisoners dug secret tunnels through these waste pits to escape. It was revolting, but desperation has a way of overcoming disgust. Historians still debate how many of these escapes actually succeeded. Some stories may have been exaggerated or even invented to spice up chronicles. You picture a desperate man crouching in the dark, nose pinched, trying to tunnel his way to freedom. The smell alone might have driven him back. Still, in a world without proper locks, the waste pit doubled as both prison feature and escape route. The guard yawns, leaning on his spear. You catch a whiff from the cells and step back, realizing that medieval justice had its own brand of punishment, enduring the smell of centuries. And maybe, just maybe, the stink was more effective than iron bars. You find yourself once again walking beneath the arches of a monastery. The bell has rung for vespers, and monks in brown habits glide silently toward the chapel. But between their prayers and chants, even monks had needs. Major historical fact. Many monasteries had communal latrines, sometimes grand halls with long rows of wooden seats built over running water channels. This allowed waste to be carried away, making monastic toilets more advanced than many town ones. Weird tidbit. Some monastic rules required monks to ask permission before using the latrine at night. In certain orders, they had to knock and wake a fellow brother to accompany them, because temptation lurked even in the shadows of the toilet. Historians still debate whether these restrictions were more about discipline or genuine fear of sin. After all, who knew what a lone monk might contemplate in the silence of midnight? You walk past one such latrine, its row of neat holes carved into smooth oak. The sound of trickling water echoes below. Compared to the chaos of city cesspits, this feels almost luxurious. But still, the monks grumble. Silent contemplation is one thing. Sharing a toilet with 30 brothers is another. You picture the line of them waiting their turn, robes swishing, incense smoke drifting in, sanctity mingling with smell. And once again, you think, cleanliness may be next to godliness, but patience was definitely tested here. Later, you find yourself seated with a monk in the scriptorium, where candlelight flickers over books. His quill scratches parchment as he copies sacred texts. Yet he tells you, in hushed tones, about the rules that governed even the smallest details. Major historical fact. Some monastic orders banned monks from speaking inside the latrine. Silence was enforced everywhere, but here especially so. The toilet was not a place for chatter. Weird tidbit. One medieval account claims that monks developed a sort of sign language for bathroom needs. Subtle hand gestures that let others know when you were heading to the latrine without breaking the silence vow. Historians still debate the accuracy of this, since evidence for monastic sign language is scattered and often tied to ritual rather than bathrooms. Still, the image is hard to resist. Solemn monks flashing discreet signs like medieval restroom emojis. You imagine the scene. One brother lifts 2 fingers, another nods gravely. No words exchanged, just silent agreement that nature's call waits for no man. The scriptorium smells faintly of parchment and ink. Candles sputter. The monk continues copying, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. And you realize medieval life was built on rules, from how to pray to how to eat, to how, in utter silence, to excuse yourself. The rhythm of their days becomes yours. You breathe slow, the chant echoing in your memory, until even the thought of latrines begins to feel oddly sacred. You walk through a drafty hall, the kind where tapestries only half manage to keep out the chill. At the far end is a narrow doorway, tucked away behind an ornate chair. It doesn't lead to a treasure chamber, but to something more humbling, the castle privy. Major historical fact. Many medieval castles had latrines built into the walls, jutting out in small stone boxes called garderobes. Waste simply dropped down a shaft, often into the moat below. Romantic, isn't it? Weird tidbit. The word garderobe literally means to guard the robes. People sometimes hung clothes inside these privies because they believed the ammonia fumes would repel moths and fleas. In other words, your favorite gown got fumigated in the bathroom. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or just occasional convenience, but the mental image is there. Noble garments swaying gently above the smell of last night's feast. You lean out of the little stone window, peering down at the moat. The water isn't clear, it never is. You hear the splash below and wonder about the soldiers who had to fight through it during sieges. Talk about a dirty job. And yet, for all its indignity, the garderobe was a step up from cesspits in town. It had privacy, a view, and, on a breezy day, some ventilation. Luxury is relative, after all. Now you're led deeper into royal chambers, where kings and queens recline on carved wooden chairs. But not every chair is for sitting in state. Some were for other states. Major historical fact. Wealthy nobles sometimes had closed stools, ornate chairs with hidden chamber pots inside. They looked like fine furniture until lifted open, revealing their secret purpose. Weird tidbit: kings had attendants known as grooms of the stool, who managed not just the chamber pot, but also became trusted advisors. Yes, the man who helped you with your most private business might also help draft royal policy. Historians still debate just how much political influence these grooms had, but documents suggest they were close confidants. After all, you couldn't exactly keep secrets from someone who literally followed you to the privy. You imagine the scene: a king frowning on his throne, quill in hand, dictating letters while an attendant politely waits with a bucket. Court life, for all its splendor, was built on these humbling moments. And so you walk the chamber, noticing that even golden crowns didn't free anyone from the call of nature. Power and politics always paused for the same reason. The tapestries sway as a breeze slips through cracks in the wall. You exhale slowly, almost amused. In these moments, medieval royalty feels strangely human. You step into the winding alleys of a bustling city. The clatter of carts and the shouts of market vendors echo against timber-framed houses leaning toward each other like old gossips. Somewhere in this crowd, someone is looking for relief. And no, not from high taxes, but from their bladder. Major historical fact: many medieval towns had public latrines, sometimes built on bridges or over rivers, where waste could be carried away by the current. The famous London Bridge even had toilets hanging over the Thames. Weird tidbit: in Paris, records show that public urinals, basins set into the walls, were provided for men but not for women. Women had to improvise, which led to whispered jokes about chamber pots being carried under skirts. Historians still debate whether women were truly excluded by design, or whether the lack of facilities was just poor planning. Either way, inequality reached even the bathroom. You walk onto a bridge where wooden stalls jut precariously over water. People shuffle in and out, some muttering about the smell, others enjoying the breeze. Below, boats glide past, their crews shaking heads at the steady contributions from above. It's not glamorous, but in a city where cesspits overflow and chamber pots fly from windows, a latrine over the river feels like progress. At least gravity and water do some of the work. The air grows warmer, steamier, as you wander toward a bathhouse. Here things get livelier. Voices rise in laughter, arguments, and the occasional splash of water. Major historical fact: medieval bathhouses weren't just for washing. They were social hubs, where people ate, drank, did business, and yes, relieved themselves. Some bathhouses even had latrines inside. Weird tidbit: in Germany, bathhouse songs were sometimes written to tease about bodily functions, blending hygiene with humor. Imagine bathing while someone strummed a lute and sang about digestion. Historians still debate whether these songs were widespread entertainment or simply jokes preserved by chance. But the idea of a crowd singing merrily in a steamy room while discussing latrines feels almost modern. You step into the bathhouse, where stone tubs are filled with steaming water. Patrons lounge, sipping wine, while a servant empties a pot discreetly behind a wooden screen. No one seems embarrassed. It's all part of life. Steam curls around you, softening the edges of voices and turning the chaos into something dreamlike. You feel your own shoulders loosen. Strange, isn't it? Even in a story about toilets, there can be comfort in warm water and laughter. You walk along a rutted road, the kind where carts creak and pilgrims trudge with staffs in hand. Travel in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly glamorous. No highway rest stops, no convenient roadside cafes. But nature's call still came knocking, whether you wore boots or sandals. Major historical fact: Inns along major routes often provided shared privies, though they were little more than wooden huts over pits. Travelers sometimes complained about the smell drifting through the sleeping quarters. Weird tidbit: pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela sometimes carried small pilgrim flasks, not just for holy water but occasionally used as emergency chamber pots when no other option was available. Historians still debate whether these flasks were truly multipurpose or if a few desperate moments gave them unintended uses. But admit it, you've had a water bottle during a long car trip, haven't you? You stop at an inn, the fire crackling, the benches crowded. A weary innkeeper points toward the back, where a crooked little hut leans against the fence. Inside, the floorboards creak, and the draft reminds you why traveling folk rarely lingered. Yet, in the smoky warmth of the main hall, no one speaks of discomfort. They raise their cups, share stories, and laugh at the road's hardships. Toilets, like travel, were just another shared experience. Night falls and you follow a group of merchants camping by the roadside. They light a fire, roast bread and cheese, and talk quietly as stars scatter above them. There's no privy here, only the wide-open fields. Major historical fact: medieval travelers often relied on ditches, hedgerows, or the edges of fields as makeshift toilets. In some areas, it was customary to cover waste with earth, though not everyone bothered. Weird tidbit: one medieval travel account suggests that pilgrims in groups took turns standing watch when others relieved themselves outdoors. Part modesty, part safety precaution against thieves or worse. Historians still debate how strictly this custom was followed, but you can imagine the awkwardness. Yes, Brother Thomas, I'll just stand here, facing that tree, pretending I hear nothing. You wander to the edge of the camp, the grass cool underfoot, the air sharp with the smell of wood smoke. The fire crackles behind you. Somewhere, an owl hoots. The medieval road was rarely safe, but in this circle of light, it feels almost secure. You return to the group, settling into your cloak. The rhythm of the day, the long walk, the fire, the necessary pauses in fields and hedges, has a strange peace to it. Life reduced to its essentials. And oddly enough, it makes sleep easier to find. The docks smell of tar, salt, and fish. You walk up a gangplank onto a merchant vessel, its sails snapping in the wind. The deck is busy with sailors tying ropes and hauling barrels. Somewhere between the rigging and the cargo, you wonder, where exactly do these men take care of business? Major historical fact: medieval ships often had simple toilets called headrails or seats of ease, located at the very front, the head, of the ship. Waste fell straight into the sea. Weird tidbit: on some ships, sailors were told to hold onto ropes while using these precarious spots. One wrong wave and you'd be making a much bigger splash than intended. Historians still debate whether larger ships provided wooden chutes for more comfort, or whether most sailors had to risk the spray and the rocking deck. You step forward, peering over the rail. The sea slaps the hull, cold and relentless. You can almost feel the nerves of a sailor balancing there, trousers in hand, hoping for calm waters. Privacy wasn't an option. The ocean was your curtain, and your crewmates your audience. But in a strange way, it fits. Out here, nature is everywhere. The sea takes your waste, just as it carries your ship. Everything returns to the tide. Days later, you find yourself on a larger vessel, one bound for a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Passengers huddle on deck, seasick and weary. It's crowded, noisy, and the question of sanitation becomes urgent. Major historical fact: on long voyages, passengers often resorted to chamber pots kept below deck. The smell, mingled with sweat and salt, was legendary. Some accounts describe sailors refusing to sleep near passengers for this very reason. Weird tidbit. A few medieval naval logs suggest that sailors sometimes used buckets but tossed them overboard without rinsing, leaving unlucky shipmates to trip over them in the dark. Historians still debate how organized shipboard sanitation really was. Some argue that captains enforced strict routines, while others think chaos reigned below deck. The truth may be, as usual, somewhere in between. You walk through the cramped hold, where people lie on straw mats, fanning themselves in the stale air. Somewhere in the corner sits a bucket, already claimed by the smell. You step back, grateful for the fresh wind above. Returning to the deck, you let the sea air wash over you. The gulls cry, the sails billow, and the horizon glows with sunlight. Life on a ship wasn't comfortable, but it was a kind of shared endurance, one that made every port feel like paradise. The sound of drums and clashing steel fades as you wander into a military encampment. Rows of tents flap in the wind, horses snort, and smoke curls from cooking fires. But with so many men packed together, one question looms. Where did they all go? Major historical fact. Medieval armies dug latrine pits on the edge of camps. Soldiers were expected to use them, partly for sanitation and partly to avoid fouling the camp itself. Some commanders even punished men who ignored this rule. Weird tidbit. Chroniclers mention that soldiers sometimes decorated their latrine areas with makeshift screens of shields or branches, an attempt at privacy that often failed spectacularly. Historians still debate how consistently these rules were followed, especially during long marches. Discipline varied by commander, and in the chaos of war, some soldiers may have simply chosen the nearest ditch. You pass by a row of pits, the smell drifting across the camp. A soldier laughs as another one trips in the mud trying to balance his armor. Humor is the soldier's shield against discomfort. In the distance, a drummer keeps up a steady rhythm. Life in the army was exhausting, filthy, and often dangerous. But even here, routines, however crude, kept the camp moving. Later that night, you sit by the fire with a group of weary men. They pass around bread and ale, their faces lit by the glow. One gestures toward the dark edge of camp, shaking his head. Major historical fact. During sieges, armies often suffered more from disease than from battle. Poor sanitation in packed camps spread dysentery, sometimes wiping out thousands. Weird tidbit. One medieval medical text advised that soldiers should face east when relieving themselves, claiming it would aid digestion and health. Whether anyone followed this advice is another matter entirely. Historians still debate whether commanders truly believed in such medical theories or whether they were simply repeating old traditions. In the end, superstition blended with necessity. You imagine the soldiers trudging toward the latrine pits in the dark, some muttering prayers, others clutching charms against sickness. Even here, bodily needs became tied to ritual. The fire crackles. A soldier strums a lute, his voice hoarse but gentle. Around you, men lean back on their cloaks, listening. For a moment, the stench and hardship fade. Life shrinks to song, bread, and shared fatigue. And in that silence, you realize, even on battlefields, humanity's most ordinary routines carried on. You descend a narrow staircase, the air growing damp and heavy. A torch flickers against rough stone walls. At the bottom, an iron gate creaks open, and you step into a prison cell where men sit hunched on straw. Major historical fact. Many medieval prisons lacked proper toilets. Prisoners used buckets which were emptied infrequently, if at all. The stench became part of daily life. Weird tidbit. Some accounts mention that wealthier prisoners could bribe guards to bring in chamber pots, or even have waste carried away more promptly. In other words, sanitation was tiered: luxury toilets for those with coin, misery for everyone else. Historians still debate how widespread this privilege system was, but evidence suggests that prison life, like everything else in the Middle Ages, was dictated by social rank. You glance at the corner of the cell, where a wooden bucket stands, flies buzzing lazily above it. The prisoners ignore it. After all, there are bigger concerns: hunger, cold, and the passing of endless hours. The silence is heavy, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling. Here, even the most basic needs become reminders of captivity. The next cell is smaller, darker. Chains hang from the walls. A single slit of a window lets in a thread of pale light. Major historical fact: in some prisons, particularly dungeons, there were no buckets at all. Waste collected on the floor or in corners, making the air nearly unbreathable. Guards sometimes used the stench as part of the punishment itself. Weird tidbit: there's a story, half rumor, half legend, that some prisoners scribbled graffiti on the walls complaining about the toilets, leaving behind the medieval version of bathroom stall writing. Historians still debate whether these markings were genuine prisoner complaints or later fabrications. Either way, it's easy to imagine a desperate soul-scratching, "This cell stinks," into the stone. You linger by the wall, tracing faint scratches with your fingertips. Maybe they're tally marks of passing days, maybe curses at the guard, maybe nothing at all. But in the dimness, they feel personal. The air grows colder. You step back, listening to the shuffle of chains, the muttered words of prisoners lost in thought. Even here, where dignity is stripped away, the routines of the body continue, stubborn as ever. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. No matter how high the walls, you can't escape yourself. You climb back into the daylight, leaving prisons behind. The air feels fresher than it has in hours. Ahead lies a marketplace, bustling and bright, the clamor of bells and cries of merchants filling the square. But hidden beneath all this noise is the constant question we've been circling. How did everyone manage the mess? Major historical fact: city officials sometimes employed gong farmers, laborers whose job was to empty cesspits at night. It was dirty, dangerous work, but essential for urban life. Weird tidbit: gong farmers were paid surprisingly well, sometimes more than skilled craftsmen, though the smell followed them everywhere. Some even had to live outside city walls because no one wanted them as neighbors. Historians still debate whether these men were social outcasts or simply treated with cautious respect. After all, they kept the city functioning, even if their work was unmentionable. You picture them at night, lanterns glowing, shovels scraping, the quiet rhythm of unseen labor. While the city slept, they cleaned what no one else would touch. An odd sort of dignity in the undignified. And you think perhaps the true keepers of civilization weren't kings or monks, but the men with buckets and strong stomachs. The day draws to a close. Shadows stretch long across the cobblestones, and the market begins to quiet. You walk slowly, passing the same streets, alleys, and privies you've seen before. The story of medieval toilets has wound through castles, monasteries, ships, and prisons, but it always circles back to something familiar: the daily, human need that unites us all. Major historical fact: by the late Middle Ages, towns began experimenting with early sewer systems, though unevenly. Some worked for centuries, others collapsed into chaos. Weird tidbit: a 14th century Parisian regulation banned people from tossing chamber pots out of windows during the day. The law encouraged nighttime dumping instead, proof that even public health had a bedtime schedule. Historians still debate how effective these laws really were. since plenty of medieval citizens ignored them. After all, rules rarely changed habits overnight. You take a deep breath, noticing how the smells of the city have softened with the cooling air. The streets grow quieter, shutters close, and lanterns flicker on in windows. Somewhere, water trickles faintly in a gutter, carrying the day away. Now the story slows. Your steps fall into rhythm, your breath steadies, and your eyes grow heavy. History, with all its oddities and smells, becomes a lullaby. And now, as the journey fades, imagine yourself drifting through those medieval streets one last time. The stones are cool beneath your feet, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Above you, stars prick the sky, steady and watchful, the same stars that shone over kings and peasants alike. The air carries the faint scent of wood smoke, the whisper of a distant bell, the murmur of voices behind shutters. The noise of the day has melted into stillness, leaving only the gentle rhythm of your own breath. You pass the places we've visited before, the crooked alley where a chamber pot once flew, the monastery with its quiet latrines, the castle garderobe perched above the moat. Each scene feels softer now, less vivid, like fading lanterns in a dream. The sharp edges of history blur into something almost tender. You walk slower, your body heavy, your thoughts quiet. The street bends, and a small breeze stirs your cloak. In that moment, you feel how ordinary and eternal these rhythms are. No matter the century, no matter the place, humans lived, laughed, prayed, argued, and yes, relieved themselves. All of it woven together, part of the same fragile thread. Now the city recedes. The lanterns dim. The world grows hushed and velvety. You sink into the comfort of stillness, knowing the journey has ended. Close your eyes, let the weight slip from your shoulders, and drift. History will wait for you always. Tonight it whispers only this: rest.